I want to first follow up on what John was saying, that today all over the world is a global climate strike. And mostly kids are out striking in the entire world about the climate crisis in our planet. And if we come, as we say, from a field perspective, we must be concerned about this. And we are very fortunate that in our community, we have Malcolm Parlett, who is spearheading, trying to raise our awareness of the global issues of climate change, global warming, immigration, migration, politics, and on and on and on. We're trying to find ways to include that and to connect it with psychotherapy without going too far to the other extreme and trying to recruit people who are coming for one thing and then having our agenda about another. But the world affects who we are, and hopefully we can affect how the world is. First, I want to thank people from the Budapest and the EAGT, both groups, for inviting me as a keynote speaker. I appreciate that very much, and I love having the opportunity to address this group. 2019 are several milestones for me. The first milestone is it is exactly 50 years ago, in September 1969, that Fritz asked me to come to Europe and do the first Gestalt workshop. And I did that with a woman who just recently died, whose name, her last name was Indeveld, Nels Indeveld. And from what I've heard in Dutch, that means in the field, or of the field. And I have been very lucky to be coming every year to Europe for 50 years, several times a year, meeting a lot of people and learning and teaching. So that's a celebration for me, exactly 50 years this month. One of the funny stories about that was I also wanted to buy a new Volkswagen while I was here in Europe. So in September, it was the 9th that I wanted to buy one, but if I waited till the 11th, I could get the next year's model. So I waited until September 11th to get the new model, the 1970 Volkswagen, and then got stopped on the way to Denmark because they didn't recognize the lights. Some of the lights had been changed on the car, so it didn't look standard enough. And getting out of Germany into a ferry to Denmark, they didn't want to let me go. It took a while to explain it was a new car. It wasn't a changed car. The third celebration for me is that this year, me, a Gestalt therapist, was awarded by APA, the conservative group of psychologists in the United States, an award for the influence of psychotherapy internationally. For Gestalt therapy, it was amazing to me that in the States, Gestalt therapy is not all that popular anymore and is starting to regrow as research is now becoming developed. Thankfully, a lot of people in our community are dedicating to research and coming up with some very good work. So it's beginning to move again in the States. But for APA to acknowledge an influence internationally of therapy to a Gestalt therapist was unheard of. And I was very pleased for me and for Gestalt therapy. So everybody's talking about a fertile void. I'm doing a little bit of a stretch here. The fertile void that I'm talking about is theory building. And theory building, as it goes on, goes into some kind of something like a fertile void, which means we have no idea where it's going. It's open, hopefully, which leaves space for creativity, leaves space for chaos, it leaves space for wonderful things, and it leaves space for difficulties. And I think we have to be aware of and sensitive to all of those possibilities. The concept that I want to talk about is related to character. Everybody knows at the individual level, character is the fixed framing, the freezing of what was a healthy adaptation in one situation that gets frozen and continues acontextually. It was almost always healthy following the biological imperative of survival, which is the first business of any living thing. When children survive, however they do that, that's healthy. The problem is when that becomes fixed, goes below awareness, what the cognitive scientists call procedural memory. That gets fixed and continues regardless of the context. That's the birth of character. It's very relieving to many clients to know that what they did is not, or what they do is not just because they're stupid or crazy, that it was a very useful, practical, healthy way that helped them to survive. The problem with it is it's out of date. It's anachronistic. Ana in Greece means wrong, chronos means time. So if you wear a fur coat in February in Siberia, that's healthy and will save your life. If you wear the same fur coat in July in Karachi, you will probably die. There's nothing wrong with the fur coat. The ecologists call pollutants a resource out of place. A fur coat is a pollutant of your life in July in Karachi. It's a lifesaver in February in Siberia. So the notion that the thing of itself is toxic or bad is not true. Even a so-called poison like arsenic, if you put it in your tea, you will probably die. But most water systems in most cities include a little bit of arsenic, and it serves to clean the water so that people don't get sick. So a pollutant is a resource out of place. Character is a pollutant of self-regulation. Character interrupts with an appropriate response. By appropriate, I mean the situation. And the situation is not something that the person meets. The person is part of that situation. It's not person meets situation, it's person and environment together, the organismic environmental field, that is the situation. Pearls was probably the first therapist who said that you cannot understand any living organism unless you understand it in relation to its environment. Living things don't exist outside of an environment. There is a co-creation, a back and forth, they are one. And it's the situation that defines what's due at that moment. It's interesting, I remember having a conversation with Laura Pearls, and we were talking about what's due the situation, and she pointed out that when what's due the situation becomes fixed, notice character again, when what's due this situation becomes fixed, what's due turns to duty. D-U-T-Y, please. duty is what you're supposed to do acontextually. What's due the situation is of that situation and of that time. Let me talk a little bit about theory, because theory has the same pitfalls as any other living thing, even though it's not per se a living thing, it's not a biological system. Theory is also self-regulating. Theory is self-regulating when it's going well, because it is in response to the situation of the time. Theory that works, that is useful, that fits the time, if it becomes frozen, if it becomes rigid, it is in a very short time out of date, because it was born from another time and it's now functioning regardless of changes in the world or changes in the people, which is obviously part of the world. So in the development of theory, there also needs to be that flexibility to stay fresh by staying with, growing, changing, pruning, deleting, adding what fits the situation at that time. As I said earlier, that leaves open to wonderful things and it leaves open to some difficulties. Excuse me. The metric for measuring theories is not, is a theory right or wrong? It's virtually impossible to determine whether a theory is right or wrong. What we can determine is whether a theory is useful or not. Does it generate testable hypotheses? Does it follow the law of parsimony, which means the simplest explanation rather than the more complex? Does it follow Occam's razor, which is like the law of parsimony, but a little bit different? It's about the least amount of assumptions. So if you're being parsimonious, the simplest, with the least amount of assumptions, then is that theory useful? If you don't become invested that your theory is right and other people's theory is wrong, then you can stay with the usefulness and the functionality of the theory. There's a Native American shaman, and I don't typically quote shamans, medicine man actually is what he would be called and call himself. And his name is Sun Bear. And what I love about him is he says, I will hold no philosophy that will not grow corn. I like corn too. But that he's talking about the practicality and usefulness of a philosophy or of a theory. If you're only interested in philosophy for the intellectual stimulation, for the discussion/arguments, for who's right, who's wrong, etc., that's one issue. But if you're interested in it for its functionality, then it has to be able to grow corn. It has to be able to be useful for it to be appropriate for a theory of psychotherapy. I want to introduce a concept that's not very widely known. Everybody knows the word and the concept of homeostasis. Homeostasis is the rebalancing back to a set point. The usual example is of a thermostat. And if you set it at 20 degrees Celsius, then the heat goes on when it goes below 20 to bring it back up to 20. And if it goes way over 20, if you have air conditioning, the air conditioning goes on to bring it back to 20. Homeostasis is a mechanical system to return to a set point. That we all know. Unfortunately, Fritz didn't know that. He didn't know there was more than that at that time when he was writing about homeostasis. And sometimes we get confused with being mechanistic, as if Gestalt therapy is trying to return people to a set point. We're not. What he was talking about was a biological system, a living system. The word for that is homeoresis. That's not a monkey. Homeoresis is in a biological system that it's a return to a trajectory. It's not a return to a set point. It's a return to a rebalancing of a trajectory, for example, self-regulation. And again, self-regulation is not a one-person psychology from a Gestalt point of view, because self-regulation is self-regulation within the environment, within the world that that organism lives in. And that's one perspective. It happens to be the perspective people coming to therapy are interested in, the perspective of how am I involved with my world. Pearls was, as I said, the first that I know of to assert that to understand people, you have to understand them in relation to their world. He was influenced, of course, by Wilhelm Reich, who was one of his analysts. Reich was the first person to say, the first analyst to say, why is this patient telling me this now? Wasn't exactly dialogic, but it was of some concern that this connection or this engagement was affecting what was happening here. Harry Stack Sullivan, an American psychiatrist, was another one who was interested in what he called social psychology, social psychiatry, excuse me, and that went back and forth that human beings are relational and within the world. And then, of course, the one that Nancy mentioned last night, the Hungarian psychiatrist, I think it was you, right? Sándor Ferenczi? That was who? Dan von Ballen, sorry. Dan mentioned him. And he was the one who was bringing up the issue of some authenticity within the room between the analyst and the patient. But Fritz was always talking about the organismic environmental field, meaning the person in relation to their environment, and that the experience of life is co-created. The focus in therapy is in the agency or passivity of the individual, because that's where the individual has jurisdiction. They don't always know they have jurisdiction. They don't always use the jurisdiction that they have, but they have the jurisdiction, the potency, the agency in their part of the interaction with the environment. Certainly they can affect the environment, but they can't go poof and change the environment and then deal with the environment. They have to deal with the environment as it is, including trying to change and have an impact and an effect on the environment. Theory is sometimes seen as something kind of lofty and abstract, and it can be those things. But all theory really is some person's phenomenological organization, somebody's meaning-making of how they see the world and how they organize that and put it together. When they take their phenomenological organization and they write it down, poof, now it's a theory. It's no different than any other phenomenological meaning-making system. For Fritz and Laura in the 1920s, they were involved in organizing their phenomenological world, their theory, in a very rich time, a very rich era in Germany. They were involved with existentialism. They were involved with, Laura especially, was involved with Gestalt psychology. They were involved with holism through Goldstein. They were involved with Buber. They were involved with Tillich, both of whom were teaching where Laura was going to school. They were involved with linguistics. They were involved with psychoanalysis, of course. They were involved with behaviorism. The list goes on and on. Fritz brought in, from his point of view, he brought in about drama and theater. Laura brought in about music and movement and breathing. And all of these things was their organizational data, if you will, for them creating the theory that they were creating in the 1930s in ego, hunger, and aggression, and then later on with Paul Goodman being involved in substantially organizing the manuscript that Fritz already had, to the 1951 seminal book of Gestalt therapy, Pearls, Hefferlein, and Goodman. But that was their organization at their time, in their era, in their world. We have a responsibility to honor that, but not get stuck with it. And Fritz also honored that because ego, hunger, and aggression then was different and more with Pearls, Hefferlein, and Goodman in '51. And he didn't stop there, he kept going, and so did Laura. And right now, Jean-Marie Robin and Charlie Bowman are editing a book. There was a manuscript found, it's only about 50 pages, that Fritz had written on an old typewriter. And this typewritten manuscript is around circa 1965. So his thoughts are changing from 1951, Pearls, Hefferlein, and Goodman, 1939, published in '47, Ego, Hunger, and Aggression. The movement keeps going. And some of the ideas, the editors have asked several of us, I'm pleased that I was one of them, to write a chapter responding to these writings of Pearls in 1965. When we read what the writings were in 1965, there's nothing terribly new in it. It seems quite usual. Well, it wasn't usual in 1965. Just as his heresy at the time, in the 30s, when he was doing, quote, the subtitle of Ego, Hunger, and Aggression, a revision of Freud's theories, that subtitle was dropped from future editions, but that was the subtitle of Ego, Hunger, and Aggression in the original publication. He continued to work with theory. So in '65, what he was saying, although today, through the eyes of 2019, it's perfectly known already. But in 1965, it was groundbreaking. It was, for some people, craziness, for some people, way out, far out, etc. It's quite reasonable now. Well, what's happened in between is most of Fritz's crazy ideas have been integrated into mainstream psychotherapy. And that what was seen as heresy at the time is now considered normal, not only for contemporary psychoanalysis, but even for CBT, for example. CBT in the old days, before it was called CBT, it was just behaviorism, used to be about stimulus, black box, response. And if you looked at the stimulus schedule, and then you would look at the responses, that was the whole system. And the behaviorists at the time said, the black box, we can't know anything about. Their notation for the black box was O. They've changed. Modern CBT is now looking at the organism, the O, within the black box, and looking at how that organism organizes the stimuli to make meaning, so that their responses are different if I'm the O and different if you're the O. The differential has to do with the fixed ways that I make meaning and the fixed ways that you make meaning. In our Gestalt language, that would be fixed perceptual gestalts, fixed ways of organizing and making meaning, which is half of what character is. The other half is fixed ways of responding. But we tend to forget that at least half, maybe even more, of character is the fixed organization of perceptions. That's been represented, repackaged as schema theory. Schema theory is exactly that, fixed ways of organizing and making meaning. That's been absorbed into many kinds of therapy. Let me mention just a few others that have been absorbed into ongoing mainstream therapy. A few more of the major contributions that have been assimilated into most psychotherapy today. The first one is the one I mentioned before, the organismic environmental field. In the early days, pre-Fritz, the classical psychoanalyst was only interested in the individual psyche. The punctuation of study was that person's individual psyche, their unconscious, unresolved conflicts. That was the work. For the behaviorists at the time, it was, as I said, the stimulus and the black box and the response. That was the extent of behaviorism at the time, from the Skinnerian earlier times, and Watson. Today, that's not true. Almost all modern therapies now recognize that you can't understand a living thing, especially a person, unless you understand them within and as part of the environment. They are a part of the system. They're not just meeting an outside system. The second one is the importance of the relationship. In the early days, the behaviorists were not interested in the relationship at all between the therapist and the patient. And the analysts were only interested in the transferred relationship. Hence the blank screen and the encouraging, supporting projection, and then the interpretation of those projections. And of course, the interpretation was based on the phenomenological organization of the therapist or the theorist, and/or the theorist that the therapist embraced. It had little to do with the person. It was preset, but I know more than you about you, so my phenomenology is essentially going to colonize the meaning for you. Fritz was interested in respecting and honoring the phenomenology and meaning making of the client. If you want to know what something means to the other person, the only source of finding that out is going to that other person, rather than going to my theory or the theory of whatever theorist I'm embracing and making a meaning for you based on who I am or he or she is. So the idea of taking seriously the client's meaning and working with the client's meaning was unheard of back in the day. It's now fairly commonplace. Another one that's fairly commonplace today is that it's not just a mechanical relationship or a transference relationship, but that there's something important between us that comes up. For many, it's a form of dialogue, which is also something that Pearls brought to the world. I mean, Pearls is no saint. He's a very imperfect guy. He had many difficulties, many personal difficulties, many behavioral difficulties. I mean, he was, in ways, a lovable asshole. He could be cantankerous and difficult and weird. He could also be brilliant and sweet and compassionate. He was a very complex guy. Let me mention a couple of more that he brought into therapy that has been pretty much assimilated. Pearl's legitimized existential anxiety. Before that, existential anxiety was something that you either avoided in therapy, or if the person had a problem with it, you tried to fix it. It's not fixable. He normalized that existential anxiety is real and is appropriate for human beings that are reflective and that understand that we all have a timestamp. We just don't know what it is. But we all have a timestamp, and we will live until we die. And that therapy can help of how to live with that reality rather than trying to morph that reality into something else, to change it, to get rid of it, to fix it. He depathologized existential anxiety and made it part of the human condition. The important one also that I mentioned briefly before was when you're dealing with taking the phenomenology of the patient or the client seriously, then you are no longer relying on interpretation as a major way of dealing with clients. Certainly, at the fundamental level, all meaning making is interpretation. All theory is interpretation. All theory, according to Pearl's, is projection. It has to be. Because the projection is my organization that's different than your organization. And the difference in our organizations of whatever the thing is we're organizing resides in me and it resides in you. And that me-ness and that you-ness is the projection. It sometimes can be accurate, but it's a projection whether it's accurate or not. So while at the one hand we realize that all meaning making is an interpretation of sorts, when we're talking about making meaning for someone else's behavior or feelings or bodily states, when we're making it for them, those kinds of causative, explanatory interpretations, we want to do that, two things. We want to do it very minimally. Is not a major part of Gestalt therapy, but we do it sometime. And to quote Sonia Neves, when we do make a interpretation, to hold it lightly. By that, what she means is hold it lightly as yours. That it's my configuration, it's my speculation, it's my extrapolation. It may or may not fit for you. It lives over here. The locus is here rather than as if I'm describing you and then the locus is there, the object of the interpretation. The object is here. It's my interpretation. It lives over here. To hold it lightly. Even holding it lightly with the built-in stereotypic hierarchical organization of a client and a therapist, still then to be very careful, because many clients will just swallow it because you're the therapist. And so they think and they hope you know better than they do. And they will find a way, those people, to justify the taking in of your interpretation. There will also be people at the other end of the spectrum that no matter how right on you are, they will immediately go no. They will quickly go no without considering. Just as the one who swallows it whole without considering. The similarity between both people is the lack of consideration, tasting, experimenting, and finding out, does any of that really resonate with my experience or not? Theories are useful until they're no longer useful, when new data comes in and you have to change the paradigm. For example, a few years ago, well now it's quite a few years ago, some crazy Australian came up with this theory that ulcers were from a bacteria. Everybody knew stomach ulcers were from stress, stomach ulcers were from emotional upset. Everybody knew that. Well, it turned out he was right. that many kinds of stomach ulcers are bacterial. They have nothing to do with stress. Similar with shingles. There was a time when people were convinced, theoretically, that shingles was an emotional reaction to stress or to anxiety or something like that. And it turns out it's related to the herpes virus. Of course, it may be triggered by stress, but that's true of any change biologically can be triggered by stress. There is a bacterial or a viral component here that before was not known. The theory in 1491, if you remember, I'm almost that old, but not quite. In 1491, the world was still flat. And the way we knew that is that if you were careful and didn't go too far, you didn't fall off the edge of the earth. When people circumnavigated and went further, the theory had to change. There are two kinds of changes for theory. One kind of change is like what I was talking about before, where Fritz and Laura made the organization of the elements in the world, and Fritz was very clear, there's nothing new in Gestalt therapy, not a damn thing. What's new is the organization. What's new is the Gestalt. How philosophy and linguistics and psychoanalysis and all the other components were organized in the 30s and 40s that he and Laura were doing. Within Gestalt therapy, there is lots of room for difference. It's a wide tent. It's a tall tent. We all start with, from a Gestalt perspective, an existential base, a foundation of existentialism that has to do with freedom and responsibility within your situation. It's not open freedom and responsibility. It's freedom and responsibility within the situation, within the limits of the situation. So that's essentially the existential base. And then what I call the three pillars are field theory, phenomenology, and dialogue. That those three make up the poles that the tent hangs on the flat ground of existentialism. Within that tent, people can reorganize. Some people will organize and emphasize working through the body. Others will work through metaphor. Others will work mostly through dialogue. Others will work mostly through experiments. Others will work through fantasy or dreams or their movement. There are many, many ways to organize the elements of Gestalt therapy and new elements that fit within those parameters of the three pillars and the existential base. And there's room for everybody within that tent. That tent constitutes some kind of a worldview. Doesn't mean your worldview or Gestalt therapy's worldview is rigid. If something comes along that is so compelling, then we have to change our worldview. But that's a whole different issue than making changes of rearranging emphasis or rearranging how we're working with parts that are already within the tent. If it's a paradigmatic shift, then you're really changing some of the foundation. And if reality is compelling, then it would be good to change the worldview and the foundational view. So for instance, today, I have interest and caution in looking at the new phenomenology, at looking at atmospheres and quasi-things. I only know a little bit about it, but I have some caution about it. It may turn out to be very, very useful. But it's also a paradigmatic switch, because up till now, the idea was the sensorial world, through the five senses, is what you, quote, know. and everything else is fantasy. May or may not be true, but if you don't know it through your senses, then you can't really know it. You can speculate, you have the assumptions, so you run into all those issues about Occam's razor, about the law of parsimony, about is there something that exists that you can't experience through one of the five senses. It may be true, but if it is, I think we have to go with some cautiousness and some positive critical acumen to see whether it fits the world, our world, or whether it doesn't. So I support it, but I don't want to swallow it. I want to learn more, and I would hope we all do that. That's just an example. There are many other things that people try and bring into Gestalt therapy, and if it's an organization, as I said, within the elements, that's fine, and there's room for all. If it's a change in some of the basic fundamentals, then I think we have to go slowly and more cautiously. The idea of homeoresis is that we want our theories to stay fluid enough and flexible enough to be able to be regulating with the world as it's changing. On the other hand, we don't want that to be license for anything goes. We do have an organizing core. Otherwise, we're just a set of techniques, very superficial, that don't have a worldview or an organizing core. And Gestalt therapy has had that. And the notion of character, whether it's character of a person or character of a society, in societal and anthropological terms, we call it institutions. For example, the institution of marriage. It's a frozen, the Western model of marriage is a frozen organization that was fitting many, many years ago, that doesn't work for many people right now, and we're still following it. When my wife Rita and I are teaching couples therapy, we frequently call it two become one, which is the fusion Western model of marriage. Two become one, and then there are none. And the statistics are misleading. The statistics say like 55% in most Western countries, más o menos, 55% of first marriages rupture and divorce. Which would make, oh, by the way, second marriage is 75% rupture and divorce. After you've done it once, you don't have to wait so long the second time. It's like, no, I'm not putting up with this, I'm out of here. So the literature would have you think that, oh, then 45% of first marriages work. Well, if staying together is your criteria for working, that's probably true. But if mutual nourishment is your criteria, then you have to rethink that. Because in that example of the sociological, anthropological institution, the character of the society, that frozen model leaves 45%, who many of which we have found to be what we call the secretly miserably married. These are people who stay together, but they stay together either because they're terrified of being alone, or they are afraid of money, and there's not enough resources, financial resources, for them to be comfortable, or they do it for the kids, or they do it for religion, or they do it to avoid social stigma, or they do it to avoid being a failure. So those are the secretly miserably married who implode. 55% explode and rupture, and some unknown percentage, but a large percentage of that 45 implode into the secretly miserably married, depression, substance abuse, all kinds of issues that come out of that. So at every level of organization, the idea of homeoresis being an ongoing living process that is organized around the field at the time, including the person who's of that field, That's the homeoresis. The homeostasis is once you get something that works at that moment, you stay with that, even though the world around you is changing and what worked here does not work here. Different explanations have been held by the culture about people's difficulties. It was the humors that were out of balance. It was the demons that were possessing the person and doing it. There was disease that was doing it to you. There was your mother who did it to you. How patriarchal is that? Blame the mother. It was the unconscious that's doing it. It's not me, it's my unconscious. It was the external world. The cookie made me eat it. That there were lots of attribution of responsibility that were some within me but not of me, and some outside of me, and the individualism has been in the process for a while of correction, and I think we have to be careful of overcorrection. In the overcorrection, now it's not on my mother and it's not on the demons or even my unconscious, but now it's the field, which is the cookie made me eat it. That the field is taking me and processing me. Of course it goes both ways. The issue is what part of it is mine, my jurisdiction, where I have agency. Because if I'm really dealt with, processed by the field, which I know nobody is saying it that strongly, then I'm doomed. There's not a damn thing I can do about it, because I need some responsibility in order to have some authority. And the authority would be within my jurisdiction. I can't change the world, but I can change with how I deal with the world. And if there are interruptions to how I deal with the world, then the therapy can focus on those interruptions. Homeoresis is a spiral that keeps rebalancing. Balance requires movement. I always remember a long time ago, after I finished my internship in California, I went back to the university where I was finishing my doctorate because I wanted to finish my dissertation, and I was afraid if I didn't go there and see those people giving me the look every time I saw them in the supermarket or something, I might not finish. So I went back there, and I was working half-time in the counseling center and half-time teaching. And I was at a coffee machine with a paper cup, and the coffee filled right up to the top. I did that every day I went to the counseling center. And usually I would go like this and hold the coffee cup and being very careful not to spill it. And I always spilled a little, not much, but I would always spill a little. Then one day, I'm getting the coffee, and the director of the counseling center comes up behind me. He was a nice guy, Harry Grader, and Harry said, "Oh, you're going down? Let's go, we'll walk together." And we started to talk. And as we're walking and we're talking, I'm not paying attention to the cup. I have to hold it by the top because it's too hot down here. So I hold it by the top, I pay no attention to it, and I keep walking and talking with Harry. And when I get to the door, I realize I didn't spill any coffee. And I wasn't trying. And that began to intrigue me. So I would get a cup of water then, and I would walk with it and try and not spill it. And almost always, inevitably, there'd be a little spill. And then I would try it the other way and just walk. And what I noticed, the difference was movement. I was allowing the movement. I was allowing the water to move and the cup to move. I wasn't trying to control it. The trying to control movement is what keeps you out of balance. Balance requires movement. I frequently talk about the person in the circus on the high wire. You will never see one still. Because if they stand still, they fall on their ass. In order to stay balanced, you have to keep moving. So this became a really important concept to me about balance requiring movement, differentiation requiring movement, relating requires movement, and if you try and squeeze it, if you try and control it, you get spillage. So homeoresis is, well, homeostasis is trying to keep it at a fixed point of not moving. Homeoresis is allowing it to move so it keeps rebalancing, but not at the same point. So I think we have a history. It's a bit colorful in some places, especially with Fritz on both the negative and the positive parts. It's colorful, but I think we have made tremendous contributions to mainstream psychotherapy that Gestalt therapy usually doesn't get credit for at all. And I don't know that our branding is so important, that we need that credit or we need the word Gestalt therapy, if in fact we're having that impact on the world and those changes are happening. So I want to support homeoresis at the characterological level of the individual. I want to support homeoresis at the theoretical level of keeping it within the current environment so that spiral keeps moving, with the proviso that we also don't quickly change our fundamental worldview, that we keep that open to new things, but not so quick as we are able to accommodate a reorganization. So here's to homeoresis for all of us. Thank you.